things in this speech. First, setup. Secondly, why this improved the domestic position of Cuba, and secondly, why it improved their position internationally. First, two pieces of setup. The first thing is empirically to point out that the Castro regime survived. Not only that, it did thrive. Castro was in power until the 2000s. He was later taken over by his brother. They are currently a single-party state. I would suggest that this is probably a relatively successful regime. But additionally, Cuba is one of the few socialist states that was not toppled after the Cold War. This is probably a successful outcome for them. Second piece of setup, what doesn't change in this debate? First, that there were already Cubans in America who perhaps, there were already Cubans in America per the info slide, but second of all, that the embargo already existed. Okay, first argument, why did this improve Cuba's domestic position? And I think the framing here is that clearly, per the info slide, there was an ongoing crisis for the Castro regime at this point in time. That looked like the Peruvian embassy having a refugee crisis, and this is the sort of thing that does affect that regime's legitimacy, and that is obviously pretty bad and not in their interest. Why is that disorder particularly bad for Cuba? First of all, this just was a large group of people who can significantly influence the economy. It was 125,000 people who clearly had enough of an intense interest in leaving the country that they were willing to act on it in this way. But second of all, they were the sorts of people who did have external support that they were able to utilize in order to undermine Castro. But third of all, they had like just a clear incentive to do that. They obviously cared deeply enough about leaving Cuba, they were willing to risk themselves by going to the Peruvian embassy, and that their only way of leaving, or their only way of continuing to be in that country, is the removal of that government. Clearly, there is a strong incentive there. What are the alternative ways Cuba could have responded to this crisis that were not engaging in the Mariel boatlift? The first is that they could have cracked down, they could have used the military, or the second is that they could engage in ideological persuasion. Here are the reasons why both of those options were untenable. The first, in terms of a crackdown, there are a number of reasons why that didn't work. Firstly, because that just does ultimately create more opposition in the long term, because things like protests create more violence, which leads to a cycle of having to continually crack down on protests that do increase in size. That is something that is untenable for the Cuban government. But additionally, it just is incredibly expensive to crack down on things because you have to involve the military, because you have to spend money on, again, contending with that cycle of violence. And note particularly with the embargo, this means it would impede on Cuba's ability to carry out the other sorts of functions that they need to do as a state. But also, this probably just looks like you having greater sanctions imposed on you, because that becomes more appealing when you to other states to do that when you appear to be an incredibly repressive government. That is obviously much, much worse for Cuba. Secondly, on why ideological persuasion is not likely to be an alternative that they could have relied on. I think, first of all, just characterizing this set of people who are interested in leaving the country, that's 125,000 people. Those people are firstly still likely to be in contact with those outside of Cuba. Therefore, they are relatively informed about what life outside of Cuba looks like and why they want to go and get that lifestyle. And also, they are relatively decided in that. Like, they probably sold a lot of their things in order to be able to obtain, be able to leave. They are probably in contact with people out there. They probably have access to, radio and so on that allows them to know that. But second of all, and critically, they have a number of grievances against the government. That means that they are unlikely to be persuaded. That is because the government has done things like taken away their land, which obviously, changes how you live your life, is something that was pretty important to those people. But thirdly, I would just suggest that at this point, Castro had been in power for decades, which just means that propaganda had already been maximized in that time, and those people didn't buy into that propaganda in the first place. They still made the decision that they wanted to leave the country. They went to the Peruvian embassy and tried to leave. That just means that these alternatives that they may try to prop on the negative side are unlikely to have worked and unlikely to have been in their interest, and why the boatlift is just the most likely to be in their interest and create less cohesion. But additionally, I think there are just benefits to the cohesion of the Cuban of Cuba because as a result of them using this tactic. First of all, there is just a narrative that they can now weaponize about how they were able to remove particular social undesirables because these sorts of people were perceived to be against, in opposition to the government. And I think this just probably builds trust for that government because they are able to deal with the crisis in a way that is relatively effective. That just means that your population believes that you are capable and competent and that you can be trusted, and that increases your legitimacy. But second of all, this just does stop a resource drain on the nation overall, because the sorts of people who are opposed to being in a communist country probably don't work particularly well in that country. They probably don't contribute much to that economy particularly, and that just means that when you remove that dead weight, you do increase the output of Cuba relatively, but also it just means you do have more resources to go around the people that remain. That just means that people do have things like, you know, they have more access to grain and rice and beans. Those sorts of things are pretty helpful in increasing the legitimacy and perceived competence of that government. Obviously, that means they do get benefits here. I think this is incredibly impactful for a number of reasons because, as noted at the top of this point, the government was in crisis at the time that this occurred, and this enabled them to market themselves as being able to deal with the crisis and increase their power in that way, but also because they just do remove actors that wish to undermine them and that do oppose them and can create greater social discohesion. And note that that is often how regimes are toppled, where you have a certain amount of people, and note this is a large number of people, 125,000, that are able to create enough dissent that creates civil conflict. And note, in the comparative, they didn't there was no civil conflict. Even if they were able to win that, that is still a bad thing to have dealt with as a regime. I think this means this comparative looks that the boatlift clearly had a number of good consequences in creating greater legitimacy for them domestically. But secondly, I think this also improves Cuba's position internationally because it just is it is something that can be marketed internationally as a good thing. Because prior to this, or like in the alternative, where you are perceived to be trapping a number of people in your country who have that proven desire to leave, that means that hostile nations are far more able to weaponize that narrative against you as being repressive, as stopping people from leaving. And it's also something that can just be analogized with some of the worst crimes of other Soviet countries. It can be analogized with what happened, with what Stalin had done. It can be analogized with what happened in the GDR. That is the sort of thing that allows those nations to weaponize that narrative. But second of all, you are just able to rehabilitate your image to outsiders positively because it just does distinguish you from those regimes because you have shown you are relatively more liberal and you're relatively more respectful of people's freedom. I think this has a number of impacts in terms of increasing your support internationally. Firstly, it just makes any appeals that other nations like the US have to sanctions significantly less persuasive. Obviously, there is always an opportunity cost to a nation imposing sanctions, and when you are perceived to be undermining the legitimacy and status of a country that has proven itself to be relatively liberal and to respect people's rights, that is something that is far, far less appealing to people when they have to pop that opportunity cost of imposing the sanction, perhaps getting less goods or more expensive goods. But secondly, it just demonstrates the power of Cuba to the US because they've moved a large number of people specifically to Miami, which means that the US had to deal with that through emergency legislation, through expediting refugee processes and so on, which just means that they are put in a relatively tense position, which just shows that Cuba has a relative amount of power on the world stage, and the US is just kind of put in a bind by this, right? Because they either look weak and indecisive if they choose to, or pretty weak if they choose to accept those people, but also they just look pretty cruel if they choose not to accept people and reject people who clearly like capitalism and are trying to escape from a regime they dislike. So I think it just probably means that the US is now more cautious in how they approach Cuba as a result of this boatlift. But thirdly, I think you also just get more aid because people are more sympathetic to a country that is perceived as more liberal. And finally, just in terms of weighing, even if perhaps this created some short-term damage to their reputation, I think this just long-term does rehabilitate you as a nation that is legitimate, as a nation that does respect, as a nation that is legitimate and moral. Very proud to propose.
If you look at every other communist regime from the 1980s in the modern day, most do not exist and the leaders are no longer there. The Castros have done exceptionally well for themselves, in part because they let a significant portion of their opposition leave the country, which meant they didn't have to deal with them internally. That is the slime dog win beside Affirmative. Two themes in this speech. Firstly, Cuba's internal dynamics. Secondly, American policy. On Cuba's internal dynamics, the first claim this team makes is that this was a massive brain drain on Cuba of young, confident people who would have contributed really, effectively. I think the first response is just evidently, well, maybe they were young and competent and capable workers. This team provides no explanation when these people hated the government as much as they suggest and were willing to leave, why they would work efficiently or how they would get them to work efficiently. Maybe sure, they have to turn up for their jobs, but there are litanies of stories, right, of people in the Soviet Union turning up and doing nothing because they just needed their pay, their presence at the end of the day. There is very little the government can do to get them to actually teach, to get them to actually engage, or maybe they are teaching but not teaching what the Cuban government wants, and I think that increases the risk because they stay in positions of power. It's unclear they are actually all useful to you. The second thing is maybe mitigation, but I think this team overstates how many of these people were essential workers in this area. And that's just because, as I say, sure, some of these people who are just confident life in the US will be great for them because they'll be able to live the capitalist system, but I think a far greater proportion are just people who have been oppressed or damaged by the regime, as they suggest, who maybe were wealthy and had their money stripped away, and are willing to risk refugee and potentially illegal status in America as an opposition. It's unclear they are going to get to work or get those opportunities. And I just think that means it's just unclear how many young professionals this is and how many remained in the country. I think quite a few probably did. But the third thing is this just explains why these are the most powerful people, and it is good that they left. Because if all of your doctors and all of your teachers and all of your professionals are against you, it's awful if then you keep them there. As they explain, you're dependent on them. Like, this team is literally like, this group was so powerful that we desperately needed them. We should have let them stay in their country and use that power to lobby against us in other ways. I think being dependent on them internally in the country was bad. The fact that Cuba evolved and maintained indicates that letting them go wasn't too bad. But fourthly, I think that this suggests exactly why the Cuban government couldn't have liberalized the economy in the way that they did. Because if you look at from other socialist countries, places like the USSR, this is literally how they fell. They started making concessions, and then pro-capitalists grabbed onto that and ordered more and required more. And that is exactly what would have happened in Cuba if this group had been there in that instance, because they would have demanded further liberalization. Furthermore, the Cuban government would have had to be hardline communists that would not have wanted to make those concessions to their existing and larger opposition, and that would have absolutely handcuffed their ability to see the economy grow and liberalize in ways that improve the lives of ordinary Cubans and allow them to have some form of legitimacy long term. So I think this just explains why liberalization is unlikely on their side. Honestly, I think you enter possibly some form of civil war, or there is a risk of it, some form of revolution or regime revolt, and this group is there and incredibly powerful. The second mechanism this team gives is just that this makes you look really weak, because it suggests no one wants to be in your country. I think the first response is just to say there is a high degree of framing that Cuba can do, particularly to their own population that remains about this exodus, and that's that you frame these people as traitors, as ungrateful, as the bourgeoisie who can't have the country in the first place, and were the reason that people suffered, like under capitalism. And I think particularly if you see an increase in conditions in the country, because you have a smaller population, everyone's share of the pie is larger. I just think that means people are likely to believe this, and not, the people in the country who have the most power are not likely to care about that. But additionally, I think it looks a whole lot weaker if you use some sort of alternative, like clamp down on them. And I would just suggest that this team is so vague about what they would do otherwise. Are they sending the troops? We don't know. What are they doing? It's unclear. I think they need to defend that. And I think other alternatives are additionally likely to look incredibly weak for the Castro regime, because it suggests that they need to shoot everyone who wants to leave, and that's 125,000 people. The final thing they say is this is bad because it allows Cubans to be free and platformed in the US to speak out against communism. I'm going to explain why. Whoa, I think there were quite a few Cubans already in the US, but it honestly doesn't matter. You can believe there was a handful, which obviously there were on the info slide. This was enough for the US to platform and to have anti-Cuba sentiment. Obviously, it already existed. There was plenty of anti-communist sentiment. It's unclear there is any sort of change here. What then do we bring in? We just explained keeping these people would have been an incredibly serious threat. It is a lot of passionate dissent that is now gone. That could have built up more support, that could have taught children to be anti-communist, and could have gained external support from countries like the US and such to allow them to do this. And it was a massive resource drain. They were not working well, they were not buying into the system, and they needed government support because everything was, everyone's, and you are instead able to improve economic conditions under our side when the government can spread it more around overall. And we just explained that it is not tenable to do anything else. The military crackdowns lead to radicalization as what started the Syrian civil war. Because you lead to a cycle of violence where protests are met with violence, which are met by violent protests, which are met by more violence, and groups radicalize, because even if they weren't anti the government now, they now have reasons to be because they know someone who was injured or who died, because people are scared for themselves. And it leads to significant amounts of expense. You need to have a lot of people incarcerated, 125,000, or killed, or some form or other under this time to suppress them into that. And as this team explains, when you are a socialist government dependent on legitimacy through providing economically for the people, spending this much money on the security apparatus is just not very great. You should probably send it on other things. And finally, it does just lead to international condemnation from other states, absolutely significantly. And sure, maybe the capitalist countries were always going to be against you in the Cold War, but there were neutral states and there were neutral individuals who were and continue to give Cuba aid in this incident, and would have been turned off if they thought the government was doing massive war crimes to the degree they possibly would have had to suppress this, or blocking people from entering the country. That's because Cuba could position itself as one of the more liberal of the communist states. It did open its borders, it did let people leave, and that means neutral countries and neutral individuals thought Cuba looked better, but also thought the US looked worse, because the US now had all these people it had to deal with. It flip-flopped around, not knowing what to do with those individuals, how to process them. It led to big debates in Miami about increased migrants and all of the problems that come with that, including things like crime, etc. And that's what been determined as an indicator of the failure of capitalism or the weakness of the US in all of its claiming, which again, I just think helps the Cuban case. The impact is massive. It leads to the country benefiting from some degree of aid, which can be redistributed or can go straight to the Castro regime's pockets. Either way, they benefit, but it also has the long-term ability for them to reform their image, to liberalize slowly, and to renegotiate with other states. Even if they haven't normalized relationships with the US, they have with other countries. That becomes a whole lot harder when your reputation is worse. Okay, let's talk about American policy against Cuba. This team says you lead to a big voting bloc, and this means they do really anti-US things. I think the first thing to say is there was already a relatively big voting bloc here. This team says it was quite hard to leave because it was a closed country. Sure, but it had been many, many years, of the Cold War, and they're relatively proximate. I think a relatively large number had been able to leave and weren't big enough, clearly by the influence side, to do this form of negotiation and see this happen. But additionally, it's just unclear what this voting actually did or why it was impactful. It's unclear that they would have gotten better policy under their side, and that's because, yes, it was the middle of the Cold War. The US was as anti-communist as it could have been. It had been so many years. Why were these Cubans the ones allowing them to embargoes on socialist states? Like, that just was the US policy. And of the Democrats as well. Like, it doesn't matter if they voted more Republican or Democrat. That just was their policy overall, especially when Cuba is roughly on their doorstep and they're likely to do that. But thirdly, I just want to say it's unclear why this policy was so bad. And this team points to an embargo, which has not been that bad for the Castro regime. They have significant amounts of money. They have not fallen. They are still legitimate. It's unclear what the implications of this have been. I don't think they've gone hungry from the embargo. Clearly, they survived it. And I think the reason it wasn't so bad is, sure, while these people hate the regime and want them to fall to some degree, I don't think they're advocating for full-on war against Cuba or anything existential. That's for sure. While you left, you still have connections that are sympathetic for the people living there, and so you don't support things like all-out 100% sanctions in that country, because that would lead to the death of people you care about in that area. And I just think that means that the policies that happened were not that bad. Evidently, the Castro regime survived and is doing quite well. It seems like a good thing for them to have done.
The negative team has been pretty inconsistent with what they think the likely counterfactual in this debate is. But I do just want to make this point. When Khrushchev was faced with rising opposition to communism in Russia in the 90s, and the choice was what Bibi said at first negative, to liberalize, what that resulted in was the fall of the USSR. Historically, allowing your opposition to leave and then maintaining stronger control over your state is what allowed the Castro government to survive. The alternatives that we explained, even the new one, that the secret third option they said, was historically terrible for other communist regimes as well and would not have worked. Two things in this speech. Firstly, talking about Cuba's international relations, and secondly, talking about its domestic environment. Firstly, on international relations. The first thing I want to deal with is their claim that the Cuban diaspora in America is exclusively the reason for the embargo, and it otherwise would not exist. I would suggest that what Cuba actually becomes analogous to in the American public's mind, if it did not let people leave, was North Korea, a rogue communist state on America's doorstep that does not allow anyone to leave because it is that evil. Like, I think they tell you it looks bad for you domestically and people don't like you if your refugees can come out. At least your refugees can come out. The alternative is a country that is even more demonized in America, and unlike North Korea, Cuba is right next to America. So I actually think they have to deal with the flip of this, which is that it is entirely worse to be viewed as a rogue actor state that is actively, not even just undemocratic, but actively violating people's human rights constantly in a circumstance where America could actively destroy it. But the second thing to note is I just don't think at any point they prove this is exclusive. The Democrats in the status quo are still anti-communist, and the embargo has existed under Democratic leadership. So I doubt this would have changed alternatively. And also, this is the same today as well. And this is not just because there are Cubans in Miami, it's because Americans in general are still dealing with the hang-ups of the Cold War, still don't like countries like Russia, even though they are not communist now, and of course are very xenophobic because they hate communism in China. So I just don't think this changes much there. But the third thing, and I think very importantly to note, is that this diaspora already exists. And the important thing here is, yes, they're obviously in smaller numbers. They don't explain why Florida is the unique swing state that has allowed the embargo to exist as well. Like, yes, they have been on the side of who has won, but it's not necessarily, they don't explain, that the increase in numbers is enough to swing Florida's election, right? They don't explain it as the tipping point for changing what Florida votes for here. But also, I would just suggest the diaspora right now in this info slide is relatively organized. They organize the boatlift, therefore they have a lot of power and capacity as well. This diaspora is probably vocal about hating Cuba. They're more vocal about hating Cuba in a world in which their family are still stuck there and they were never gotten out. So I just think that diaspora is also likely to be there as well. So I just don't think this is exclusive. I don't think they explain how it is the tipping point. And I think perhaps I flipped it. It's even worse from their side of the house. Secondly, on international perception and why this is very important. The
The first thing to note is I do think you gain some support for Cuba amongst neutral states who are not involved in the Cold War, and just people within America as well. That is, Americans during the Cold War were fed a lot of propaganda about how communist states were evil, they were undemocratic, and they did things like in East Germany and the USSR and not let people migrate. Cuba allowing people to migrate actively goes against that propaganda. It makes Cuba seem like a better version of a communist country, and people then feel like America has been lying to them and become more sympathetic. I do think it is important because they say, well, it doesn't matter because Cuba got no aid. This is factually untrue. Cuba did receive aid from the USSR and other communist states at this time, and if these people direct money towards leftist groups that have helped to fund Cuba or towards support towards other parts of the Cold War, that is good for Cuba in general. But I would also just suggest it is in the interest of the Castro government for people to be less anti-communist as well. Like if more people think that Cuba is a better state than they do alternatively, that is good for Cuba in the long term as well, because it means you have more opposition to the embargo that I think does exist today as well. But also, yeah, the other thing that I would just point out is they say that people learn that Cuba is a really bad place to be. I already think people in America do think that Cuba is a bad place to be because of the propaganda that exists during the Cold War. They already think it is terrible, and in fact, I would point to the ways that North Korean migrants are held up as singular examples right now, when some people inevitably still do escape Cuba regardless of whether or not we let them go. Those people are obviously viewed as far more worse instance because they were not allowed to go. They had to actively escape it as well. They tell you that you can stop people from talking about these things that wouldn't get out internationally, and Cuba just kept it domestically. The first thing to note is Cuba is extremely close to America, and you can do things like have radio communications. And also famously during the Cold War, America was doing this. They had their radio-free programs to allow them to interact, to allow them to spread propaganda to people both domestically, which is why they still have power there and can interfere when people buy into America's ideas. But secondly, that people also did have contacts outside of Cuba, and that is how these things got organized as well in the first place. But also, the crisis occurred at the Peruvian embassy. Third states were already involved, so it doesn't remain in the remit of the Cuban government anyway as well. Also, finally, just an important thing to note here, I think Cuba just does get comparatively more advantage by any more positive perception of it internationally. Like America has done, short of going to war with it, the worst that it can do. It has embargo on it, and that remains stable. What happens, at least when Cuba gets slightly more support from neutral parties in the Cold War, or through anyone trying to attempt to send more aid that might be able to get through the embargo, that is a massive benefit. Secondly, on domestic stuff, how does Cuba deal with this crisis? They are inconsistent down the bench. They suggest either they do things like relaxed communism, or they do things like repression, or they suggest this is not big enough to change anything. I'll try and deal with all of them now and explain why those are not good alternatives. Firstly, on relaxing communism, the first thing to point out is this is just unlikely to be the way that the government deals with it. It's unlikely to be willing to give up the goal of socialism immediately. It's likely to titter and tatter over a period of time, suggest it might, and then pull back, and that's really bad. It also responds to the stuff that Will says about this as being a small group, because obviously, yes, this is a small crisis at the time in which they agreed to deal with this. This doesn't mean the crisis did not spiral over a longer period of time, which is the point at which people believe there might be a possibility, or the government suggests a degree of openness to potentially relaxing the laws. You just wait for a little bit. More and more people believe they actually can have power and capacity over the government in the first place in those situations. They also describe this group to us as young and competent people who have relative capacity to make a big influence to Cuba, and also probably people who feel aggrieved by the existence of the government, and who are now seeing a viable route to push back against the government in having collectivized action in a way that did not exist in the earlier decades. So this is why it is the tipping point for a relatively small group to become more powerful. But also, they explain the Castro government is likely to do things like suppress what people are saying about Cuba. They say this in their own speeches, which means the response is not just likely to be a peaceful, let these things die down. It is actively encouraging these people and actively cracking down on these people and going into people's houses and trying to find where they have the radios that they're communicating with the US mainland and how they engage with their relatives and stuff like that. And so that is active repression. And they explain the active repression is likely to be particularly bad in these circumstances because all you need is one act of repression for someone who is previously kind of ideologically neutral, just didn't want to get involved, to suddenly feel like it's a grave moral harm that they are not fighting back against the government, or that they may be threatened, or they know people who have been threatened by the government as well. So when they tell you that there is likely to be repression here, I think that is just atrocious for the Castro government, because they explain that these people are likely to have access to resources, they're relatively educated, they're relatively young and willing to be engaged, and now these people feel like for the first time they have a possibility of getting a change, and they have people who agree with them. And I think this is worse than at any point in which the Castro, Castro kind of goes back here. Yeah, that's the other thing. Also, the other thing to note here is that these people also have the capacity to push back because they do have things like foreign support. Like, this is the 80s, the borders of Cuba are not entirely secure, and America is very close, and they're maintaining the embargo. There is definitely the possibility that they can support with weapons or other assistance as well these people domestically. So I think just comparatively, you just get rid of these people, even if you think they say bad things about Cuba. If these people say bad things about Cuba in America, America cannot really do anything to try and use that or weaponize a group of people within Cuba who are sympathetic to their interests. What happens on the outside of the house is these people get increasingly pissed off because it's been demonstrated domestically that people do want to leave Cuba, that has been ignored by the government, and therefore these people are increasingly pissed off, and they're now more likely targets for American interference in trying to undermine the Castro government as well. Any claim, this is really important, and also this crisis is also catchy, right? Because anytime this crisis occurs, it's described as a crisis in the info slide. That's Cuba's economic system working worse, which means even regular people who might like socialism when it works for them, it's no longer working for them, so they don't like socialism anymore. They're also willing to fight as well. Any claims that they make about brain drains, about why these people are good, continued on resolving this crisis, which I just don't think they can explain. But we also explain why there's just better economic conditions under our side of the house. The pie is slightly smaller, but the average productivity of the person who lives in Cuba is much higher, because they're no longer protesting by not doing their job properly. They say a shit doctor is still a doctor. No, a shit doctor is destroying your medical supplies and actively harming the alternative, which is training your own doctors and allowing them to do a job much better. Obviously, we are the side that better improves conditions in Cuba and also its international position. Proud to propose.
Great, thanks so much for the
we good to go? Oh, yes. This is a team that says that the benefit of preventing, the benefit of the boatlift is that it prevented a potential revolution. And yet, it's the same team that says that this is a regime that already survived for 40 years when most regimes barely last 10, and it's already survived a perpetual embargo. This is a team that says, well, the US might soften its pressure on Cuba when it's opened its border once, and then says, when it's convenient for them, the embargo would have been symmetric on either side, so a Cuban diaspora is inconsequential. No, Ali, we weren't inconsistent, you were. I'm going to begin the speech very clearly by explaining why their greatest harm, the risk of revolution, is nil, which means that the freestanding benefit of just making sure that Cuba would have been poorer in the interim is a basic minimum. And I want to begin by explaining why that benefit is so important. Because the way in which they try to respond to this is to say, well, we know that Cuba would, like, the brain drain didn't lead to a Cuban revolution, which is why they wouldn't have cared about this. There are two problems with this. First, the Cuban government would not only have a disincentive to avoid a revolution, it would also have a positive incentive to want to have a stronger economy, which is to say that a more richer populace means that you're able to extract more rents from that population. A more richer populace is also a happier populace, because that's a populace that is more willing to tolerate further restrictions on their civil liberties, because most people index their overall well-being towards their material well-being, which is why obviously they would care. But secondly, we also explained at Bibi that this is not, like, relative to other authoritarian states, the most evil and authoritarian regime. This is a Cuban government that, for example, has invested in ensuring that 99% of its people are literate and that it has universal healthcare, which suggests that they have a revealed preference to, at the very least, respect some of its values of being a Marxist state, which is why they also independently care about material well-being. What are their responses to this claim? Their worst response at Ali is to say, oh, the Soviets would have provided aid. That aid would have occurred symmetrically. So that doesn't work. And better response is to say, well, these people are really reluctant workers, so they wouldn't really do a good job. Now, the kind of trick that they pull here is that the only reason why these people would be reluctant is if they realized that they had an opportunity to go elsewhere and they were deprived of that opportunity. But we were never going to give that opportunity in the first place. It's unclear why people in the alternative would have thought that they would have been able to get a better job and a better life outside of Cuba, because it would have not been a possibility to them that they could even leave in the first place. Which is why, even if they might be a little unhappy because they're poor, they wouldn't be so unhappy they would protest at their job because they didn't realize that there was an actual alternative waiting for them, because we never would have done this policy in the first place. Which is why this mechanism does not work. But second of all, they actually don't do a good job of explaining why people would be so willing to protest in their job and do it badly that it would risk their livelihood. If you just fuck around and not do anything with your hospital supplies, you get fired. Eventually, people's self-survival kicks in, which is why an imperfect, reluctant worker is better than having no worker. So we're still able to win on that. So that is why we get greater economic productivity, and that is a freestanding benefit. I will now compare that against the risk of revolution. This risk is very, very low. The key thing I would note is that they actually never explain why, independent of this good, Cuba was in a position that was so fragile, the regime. And they concede that this is a regime that has already lasted 40 years. That is far, far longer, almost twice as long as virtually any other Soviet regime. We would know that most regimes collapsed probably in the interim years, immediately after revolution, after the the hang-ups of winning the revolution and all of that. It's those first 20 years that are the most testing of a regime's ability to survive, because that is when you're not able to live up to your promises, that is when people get angry. Cuba has already passed that by their own concession, which means that it's very, very likely that the Cuban government was not in a position to really be meaningfully at risk at all. But I will now engage specifically with their mechanizations. The kind of trick they pull here is that they try to assume that the vast majority of people who wish to leave the country are therefore also people ideologically opposed to the country. We agree that that's probably a minority and it's a subset. The question is whether they're a majority. I'm going to give you two reasons as to why that's unlikely to be the case. The first is just that the first thing to say is that this was not a selective exit of people, right? Like the Cuban government did not selectively boot out everyone that was ideologically opposed to them. Fidel Castro literally just said, if you want to go, go. So it's not the case that this was so selective as they were willing you to believe. Second of all, the far more powerful characterization that we just give you is just that the vast majority of these people left because they were poor, not necessarily because they would therefore agitate while they were within the regime, which is why the number of people aren't so ideologically opposed. But even if they were, and I'll be generous here, it's not clear that this set of people would be able to build a meaningful enough mandate amongst the broader population of the Cuban population, such that they could meaningfully topple the Cuban government. And weirdly, they can see this at Second Affirmative when they're like, you could frame them as former members of the bourgeoisie that are now agitating because they want jobs at your expense. Yeah, if you can do that after they leave, it's unclear why you couldn't also do that while they were within and agitating within Cuba. So if you believe that you can propagandize that, you can also propagandize here. But also, we would explain that propaganda is likely to be quite effective, which is to say that we explained at Bibi that a vast majority of people wanting to leave, or some portion of them, were people who were previously wealthy families and landowner families, i.e. the people detested by the vast majority of the Cuban population, because those are the people that the revolution was waged against, which is why it's very, very easy to paint them as enemies, and therefore that they do not get meaningful buy-in from the rest of the Cuban population in order to mount the revolution. We also would note things like, for example, a portion of the 125,000 people were people like prisoners, who are not well liked because they commit crimes, or like undesirable minorities. Unfortunately, like ethnic minorities, religious minorities, sexual minorities, who also find it difficult to attract buy-in because of the various bigotries that exist in the population. So that explains why even if these people themselves are very, very angry and mobilized, they don't get any other external support. The last thing though is that they actually never explain why the way to remove this threat is via a boatlift. The weird thing they say in Ali is like, well, you can't do a tacit ideological concession. Like Cuba did. Like their private businesses exist in Cuba. Like they already did this. Our point is that they could have done it a little earlier in order to satiate these people. And second of all, the reason why you know that just because you make a concession doesn't necessarily open the floodgates is that the equal logic is true of their thing. Like they only did their thing once of an exodus. The argument that a concession leads to a forever cascade of other concessions could equally have applied to explaining their phenomena. That one exodus could have led to multiple exoduses. That did not happen, which suggests that you can make tacit concessions. But also, the point of a tacit concession is the distinction between actively encouraging things, which could be then framed as the government being very, very weak, as opposed to just merely permitting it by secretly not enforcing it. The latter is far more powerful because you always have the plausible deniability. Maybe your business has been cracked down upon because the government actually just overlooked it, but people never really know actually whether or not they're actively encouraged, which is why you're able to provide these concessions to people that make people happy because they're able to do private businesses while also keeping them under a leash, which is why the risk of revolution is ultra low. We've already wanted them to destroy that. So, I'll now move on to how this affects the behavior of the United States towards them. Now, look, they say there's already a large enough Cuban migrant diaspora in America. We say there's a lot. The only thing, one thing you know for sure is that now there's 125,000 more of them, right? Bush versus Gore in Florida was 1 month less. So clearly there is far more people. They can't ever run away from this margin. The weird thing they say at Ali is to say, oh, well, the migrant diaspora that already existed in America would have been even angrier if you hadn't done this. But they can see that these migrants only are there because they migrated 40 years ago. It's very unlikely they have family living, so it's unlikely they do it here. They then say, oh, you soften up when you allow people to leave. You open the border once. How does this influence the tipping point as well? At all. And that argument, the fact that US can soften, suggests that there is a demand for softening, and that demand is stifled when the same people that would have otherwise supported that demand are the very people opposing it and asking you to enforce an embargo. We are very, very proud of us.
I'm going to start with the alternatives that they explain for how Cuba shores up its legitimacy domestically should they have not done this, and then I'll talk about international standing. But the first thing I want to note at the top of this domestic legitimacy point about the alternatives is that they need to at least show that the alternative would have resulted in an empirical reality that is better than what Cuba currently has, which is a regime that is like a system, a communist system that is basically the only socialist state not to have toppled after the Cold War, and the Castros remaining in power into the 2000s, and then, you know, continuing on in their family legacy. I just think that that is an empirical reality that is hard to beat, but they pose many alternatives at different points down the bench to suggest how they could have shored up that legitimacy alternatively, none of which work. First, they try to explain that the liberalization of communism would have helped them here. However, unfortunately, the response to this that we give you is that obviously that the liberalization did occur after the opposition had left, and the reason was that it had to occur after the opposition had left, because otherwise the opposition is then emboldened to ask for more concessions, which would have led to either a liberalization of the economy that was significantly worse in toppling that communist regime, or alternatively would have resulted in the sorts of civil conflict harms that we explain, because that opposition is just much more emboldened when they do those sorts of things. That just explains why that couldn't have occurred in the status quo where those people were still in the country. That alternative does not work. The second thing they try and rely on is, well, maybe there would be some crackdown on the expression, or censorship of the expression of Cubans criticizing the country in there. And they explain, well, this is not likely to lead to a civil conflict because these people are just not ideologically invested enough in order to do this, because, you know, they're leaving Cuba because they are just unhappy and poor. I think, note firstly, the tension that exists here with how they explain this would mean they criticize Cuba once they leave to the US in ways that are particularly harmful for Cuba. If they are only leaving for non-ideological reasons, that benefit does not work. But I would also suggest, for the reasons that we say, that this actually, when you are actively engaging in repression, when you are stopping people from criticizing, when you are stopping people from leaving, maybe people initially didn't want to engage in revolt, but this is the sort of thing that activates them to do that. Because if the Cuban government is killing your family, that actually probably is something that causes you to want to revolt. In fact, it is the most proximate thing that probably encourages you to do that. So I just suggest that is probably something that would be likely to occur. But even if it isn't, even if civil war is a speculative harm, it's clearly and is sufficiently large harm that it is something that you would want to avoid, even if that is a civil war that you could survive. That is obviously a huge damage to their huge damage to their credibility. The final thing that they pivot to a third is that, well, maybe, you know, ideologically these people can be persuaded. Unfortunately, we did deal with this at first by suggesting these people just do have significant grievances with the Cuban government because their land was taken away, but also that government has been in power for a long time, so that propaganda just never worked. They give no reasons that means that this ideological persuasion isn't likely to work. These people don't settle down into the long term. Those protests just do not die out. I think, therefore, the only way to shore up this domestic legitimacy is what was already done in the status quo, which is to remove your opposition from doing the sorts of things that internally damage you, that drain your economy, that make you seem like a less legitimate country to the people in that country, and that avoid civil war. Those are the sorts of things that that should matter more in this debate. But dealing with how this affects Cuba's international standing, because their key claim here is, and what they attempt to hang their hat on at the end in their reply speech, is that the US policy is likely to get significantly worse, which just means that you will do worse as Cuba, I guess. But I'm just kind of, there are a number of things you have to believe that, this would result in worse US policy in order for that point to work. Firstly, you have to believe that the Cubans that arrive in Florida are just a tipping point for any future election, which I just think is pretty untrue, considering obviously there were already Cubans in Florida who composed a voting bloc. But also, this is 125,000 people out of a 350 million person electorate, which is obviously not very large. But also, you have to believe that there was some sort of form of alternative to being in opposition to Cuba during the Cold War, which clearly this was a pretty hawkish part of the Cold War, which is something that didn't matter. So I just think that this persists overall, and that is obviously incredibly bad. This doesn't affect their standing internationally. This affects their standing internationally in far better ways than they try to explain very proud.